Praise the Lord and welcome to Inner Court Ministries of Maryland, where Bishop Dr. Jonathan Wallace Sr. is our pastor. My name is Sister Lorraine Berkeley, and it is my privilege to share with you what we call our noonday nugget. Be blessed. The topic that I'll share from is in his hands, and I'll share the very familiar account of Jesus as he feeds the multitude with 2 fish and 5 loaves. This account is found in all 4 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and St. John. I'll be reading from St. Matthew, but referencing St. John as well. This is a very picturesque event that is often told in children's church, in vacation Bible school, forums where the youngest of children are taught. But this very powerful event, this message is for all hearers. It brings a smile to my face every time I hear it because it makes me proud of my God and how great He is. He's not just the miracle worker in this event, but in our everyday lives, He proves Himself to be a miracle worker. The text that I'll read from is Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. And it reads, "When Jesus heard of it, he departed thence by ship into a desert place apart. And when the people had heard thereof, they followed him on foot out of the cities. And Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion toward them. And he healed their sick. And when it was evening, his disciples came to him, saying, This is a desert place, and the time is now past. Send the multitude away, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves victuals. But Jesus said unto them, They need not depart. Give ye them to eat. And they said unto him, We have here but 2 loaves, 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And he said, Bring them hither to me. And he commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass, and took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and brake, and gave the loaves to his disciples, and the disciples to the multitude. And they did all eat and were filled. And they took up of the fragments that remained 12 baskets full. And they that had eaten were about 5,000 men, beside women and children." There are several themes and messages in this experience where Jesus and his disciples feed this 5,000 plus followers with just these 2 fish and 5 loaves. One of the ultimate messages is that the world must be fed by Christ and his church. Like the disciples, our faith will be tried in the process. But it is when we recognize the power that we possess from the one with whom we walk that we embrace and cease to worry about the surmounting challenges. We just need to go on and do his will, knowing that the all-sufficient one is sufficient to supply and replenish when we bring the need to him. Feeding this multitude required more than fish and loaves. It required compassion on the part of Jesus and on the part of the disciples. The disciples had just learned of the beheading of John, and they were sorrowful. But in spite of their personal pain, their love won out. This multitude had witnessed the miracles of Jesus and were seeking Jesus for his ongoing power to intervene in their lives. The multitude had traveled through the mountains to follow him. After ministering to the people, Jesus was mindful of the multitude's need for nourishment, and he called for the food that was available. Jesus knew that the lunch of the young boy in the crowd was not sufficient, but that was the least of his concern. He was the author of the plan, and the plan was more than feeding the mouths and stomachs of the people. The plan was to feed the hearts and minds of his disciples. The disciples witnessed Jesus' compassion and his miracle-working power as he refused to allow the multitude of followers to go away hungry. Jesus demonstrated for them the essential compassion that leaders must exhibit, not just in word, but in deed. Jesus compared the multitude to sheep without a shepherd, and he, the good shepherd, stepped in to care for, to feed, and to lead them. As a model leader, Jesus gave of himself and his time in spite of his tired body and physical resources. Notice I said physical resources. This wonderful act of feeding the multitude revealed the mindset of the disciples. Jesus observed the thought process, the heart, the faith of the disciples while inquiring where food was accessible. It is noteworthy to mention that in John 6:5, Jesus asked where food could be found to feed the multitude. That verse says, when Jesus then lifted up his eyes and saw the great company coming unto him, he said to Philip, whence shall we buy bread that these may eat? In John 6:7, Philip responded telling Jesus what instead of where about the insufficiency of the food and the lack thereof. Philip's doubtful response indicated that he was more focused on the size of the crowd and the need rather than on the power of Christ that he had witnessed as Christ performed miracles and achieved the impossible. Jesus embraced this opportunity for his disciples' growth in faith and obedience. The disciples stood with Jesus as he lifted the fish and the loaves and gave thanks to God and blessed the 2 fish and the 5 loaves. After the blessing, the disciples came to Jesus to receive of the 2 fish and the 5 loaves to distribute to the people. The multitude was so vast that the disciples returned to Jesus again and again and again and again, several times to replenish and continue serving until every single person in the multitude was served. While the disciples were aware that there were only 2 fish and 5 loaves, their faith was once again increased, and they were more keenly aware that the meager provision in the hands of Jesus was miraculously more than enough. There was no depletion of the fish and the loaves as faith became substance, and 12 baskets of fragments were taken up from less than a single brown bag lunch. It's also noteworthy to mention that in every culture, even in biblical culture, children were not necessarily the daily providers and were generally relegated to the background. In this account, we see that nothing and no one is too small to be used of God. The young boy's lunch, given selflessly, became the meal surrendered for God's use. So we need to teach our children to pray and to surrender what they have to God. As believers, it is essential that we consistently return to the presence of God to pray and to seek him for provision, not just for our bodies, but for our spirit man. Our spiritual and natural food are gifts, and we should always give thanks to God for them. He has an unfailing eye and an unfailing heart toward us. In this account, Jesus demonstrates to the disciples that all things are possible. He models that God is a God of plenty and is able to supply all of our needs when we are compassionate, obedient, and continuously seek him. We've got to learn to trust and to obey. The message to the disciples is the same as it is to us today. Trust him and put everything in his hands. God bless you. Thank you for joining us today.